So introduce myself. I'm David B. Cross. I'm the Senior Vice President and CISO for the Oracle SaaS Cloud, the larger company at Oracle.
And I'm Gadi.
Okay. So why in the world did we write this paper, right? Well, it's because there's a problem. There's a need, right? And it's clear and present. We're going to drill down into this quite a bit, today. And we're going to try to have a little time for some questions as well, right? But really kind of giving a state of the world, what we think some of the risks are, and really what's kind of different in some of our recommendations in this area.
So one thing that's kind of important to mention on this slide is that when we first approached it, we've been talking amongst ourselves and with many CISOs on the topic for a while. And what happened was that we prefer to talk tech, right? What can we do? What's actual risk? And stopping to understand for a second, wait, we're talking about risks, but we don't really understand the technology. If you look to OpenAI, they don't necessarily understand the entire technology too and how it works or why it works. How can we start talking about risk? And what happened was a lot of boards started asking questions, right? What are our risks? How do you prioritize them? The Samsung incident happened when there was a sort of leak where people used the technology incorrectly, and all the legal officers started asking what's going on. And the way we saw about approaching this is talking about what is the most basic thing we can do if we have no controls, if we have no technology. And that's to think it through from a risk perspective and to try and develop the most boring thing in the world, enterprise policy.
So really what is the state of the world, right? I think the really cool thing, which is very exciting, is that, hey, GenAI, ChatGPT, it's being adopted rapidly. Like everybody is adopting it. That's exciting, right? But unfortunately, I think security, as we're learning here and looking across the industry and businesses, is security is just beginning to engage and be involved with some of these businesses and product groups on that, right? I think the other element is there is a lot of FUD out there, right, of what's going on. And so despite Gadi and I both being science fiction, aficionados, right, it's really—
The right word is geeks, sir.
The AI is not taking air. It's not Skynet yet, right? But it is a good book we recommend.
I would say that a little bit about the FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. We always do that in security, but when we don't have enough information, we often base ourselves on what we have, which is the news. So for example, data leak risks, which we're going to go into in a minute and compare it to SaaS, have been big. Everybody was saying ChatGPT specifically, although GenAI is larger than that, would take your information and then your competitor can get it back. And that became a leading theme in discussions when we know for a fact these models cannot update in real time. They cannot take that information in. Yes, you're choosing to send it out to a third party, but that's simply false. So I want to highlight that. And we're not saying they won't use it necessarily for training future models, although in security we know how dangerous it is to use user input. But it's something to consider as we go into this. We don't really know a lot yet.
So I think the one thing, as I say, is that, what are some of the risks, on, these areas? So we covered a lot of them in the paper, and I wish we had enough time to go over all of them, but we wanted to maybe kind of drill into a few of those, right, that we think are very important to understand in a few minutes that we have today. And so, Gadi, what one, is your top of mind immediately when someone asks, what are some of the risks?
Absolutely. So when we started looking at this, the one thing that immediately popped up was model risks. We completely removed them from our paper because there's a lot of it out there and we're looking more at the enterprise. So what's left is all of this. And when we look at data and privacy and confidentiality, data privacy and confidentiality, if you like, you're trusting a SaaS product, which we'll go into in a minute. But what's happening right now is this is kind of technology that reminds us of back when Mozilla started, when the internet so-called started, when the cloud started, when social media started, when the iPhone or smartphone started, where it's flowing through our fingers, we have no control, and we don't want to block the business, we want to enable the business, but at the same time, without some controls, the business can't enjoy the value proposition or the competitive advantage. So how can we put controls in place, even if it's just the policy saying what to do or not to do, so that we can say, don't send out confidential information, don't send out private information. We're not sure, honestly, between us, that philosophically blocking really works with this kind of technology, as opposed to enabling this flow SAML tokenization. But it's not different to much other SaaS in SaaS technology you would see. But this is the first thing that pops up immediately. The second, which usually we wouldn't necessarily look at here, is legal and regulatory, because the risk is immense. We're not going deeply into all of these topics because we can just refer you to the paper. You can read the blog instead of listening to us talking, but legal and regulatory are everywhere. One example that people have been talking about, and the CISO has been asked to become sort of an expert on with the legal team, is if I'm using this code, if I'm using this text, does it belong to where it was harvested from originally when they trained their models? Is it ours? Is it OpenAI's or Copilot's? So that's a major issue stopping a lot of organizations from moving forward, which brings us to copyright and ownership, which is very interesting in that regard, which I'm kind of skipping over and putting the two of them together, and insecure code generation. So a lot of is being done right now. If you look at Copilot and how they're taking their code through tests, and a lot of the technology is advancing really, really fast, but people are already using even ChatGPT as the equivalent to what they used to do with Stack Overflow. And if they copy that code and there is a vulnerability in there, does it go through the same processes? Is it the code? Is it the same as treating any other AppSec process? What happens if you have something that is being generated for thousands of organizations? Smaller, larger risks, monoculture, a lot of things and thoughts from the 90s. David, do you want to speak quickly on trust and reputation?
Absolutely. Certainly, we know that, especially the enterprise, right, is that if you're using GenAI and actually building content based on that, but what if it's inaccurate and it's pushed out? How would that affect the reputation, of the company? We certainly know that there's been some examples already, is that putting out inaccurate information, even if you claim it's coming from AI, right, it's not going to build a good brand for your company, right? So people you want to have trust with your company, and you need to be able to trust the information, the content, the data that you're getting from these models. And this is where I think some of the challenges come into play, is then how is things validated from once they're generated to once they're being published publicly under your name. Next. So one of the questions that people often ask is that, well, how is this different than, SaaS security? Everything, as I talked about at RSA a few weeks ago, right? Everything's moving to the cloud. It's not if, everything is moving to the cloud. So it's just another SaaS application, isn't it? Well, in some ways, it is about identifying and scoping the risk that you have, with use of that application, right? Everything is like who's using it, what they're using it for, but it is more than that. Gadi, would you like to share a few thoughts in that area?
Sure. So one of the things we looked at is usage. Yes, there are many SaaS applications out there, but let's take Grammarly for a second. Very useful. So many people use it. I use it. But do you change your entire workflow with Grammarly? Do you upload entire documents in order to change them into presentations? Do you create your code with it? It feels kind of like the move from having a box in the cloud or a shell account to having, on the internet in the 90s to having the cloud. So we'll ask in a second, is this technology any different really? Should we change anything really? I would like to state that my thoughts, and generally CISOs agree with this, but I'm careful here, is this is SaaS security. It is a third-party risk. Yes, then there are others.
Okay. So one of the things is that many people have asked, and I think this actually was a little bit of, kind of some debate, right? An element is that, okay, now that we have GenAI, right, do we need to create a brand new policy or standard within our enterprise? Well, I think in a general sense, really, it's ideally you want to update or revise your existing policies, right? Some may need some new things, right, about that, but it's not about, you're now starting with a brand new recipe, right, versus building upon your existing policies right there. But a lot of it is about the usage, right? But like we have the same types of usage for social media and other types of things, but how we can apply that to GenAI as well.
So I would like to double down on this for a second, because so many people have brought it up. At least 40 CISOs out of the 80 that worked on this brought it up. Why do we need new policies? So I'm gonna go and agree with most of that, but then I go to the cloud and say, okay, so authentication is a basic policy we have since the 80s. Do we really need a new authentication policy over the cloud? One of the things that's so different about this technology is not just that it's changing the way we work, but everybody in every role can use it, right? So for example, if we start discussing policy, let's try and consider, how do these GenAI policies affect the enterprise? Do we embed the GenAI into our infrastructure? Another question is to say, are these customizable? Or do we just get whatever these service providers provide for us? Are there enterprise dependencies specific to GenAI? Because technology is different than what we've used before, right? I'm going to run through this. We can't go through the entire document, naturally. But what integrations would it have access to? Right? Would a customer success chatbot have access to all user data? Would you be able to offer compensation on missed deliveries with all these different AI attacks? So the more we start to think about this, the more we start to say, maybe what we need here is also not just escalation path, such as you would do usually in policy, and some GRC is boring for some people, but it's definitely where we start before we have technology. We need elevation, right? We have an issue here we thought about. How do we approach the users? How do we include them in this? And there is something unique. So yes, awareness training, right? What everybody says when they don't know what to do, which is important, guardrails for engagement, all of that is true. But where have we had before the need to tell employees, please remember, this is not a real human being you're talking to? It's quite mind-boggling. And I would add to that very quickly that look, for example, I'm going to change the topic slightly and then turn it back to David. Even if we ignore the technology works and we ignore everything else, we've already seen attacks that are different. There are many conversations out there. For example, Adam Shostak has asked, we're calling these injection attacks, prompt injections, AI injections. Are they actually injecting anything? But then we have seen not just injection attacks or jailbreaking attacks from users, but rather the LLMs that can go and harvest the web being attacked that way. So we do need to spend at least a little bit of time thinking, what are we using it for? How are we using it for? How it affects us? New policy is required, but yes, where we started earlier, a lot of it should already fit within what we already have.
So coming back, I think a big an element, and certainly I've been looking at a lot of the questions on the Slack channel. We'll get to in a minute, but a big element is, I think, as in the future here is that once you've identified the risk, is then what are going to be the controls, right? What are the mitigation services that you're going to choose and deploy or implement your environment based on the risks that are specific to your enterprise? And I think this is the exciting and very, very interesting, space, is what technology is going to evolve and make what choices are going to be available, to help customers or help businesses to mitigate those risks, right? And we won't drill into those, but I think that's going to be very fascinating. The other element, which I think is people that the technology and the capabilities are massive, right? But when will it make sense, or where will it make sense, right, to have your own LLM, right? Where will that you don't want to use a public one? Sometimes there's benefits, but also times is there more benefits, and what will appear to actually have a restricted LLM to your environment? Okay. So in the paper, and I think of calling out that a lot of people have been asking, on the things, is that, what are some of the risks, what are some of the policies, right? And, it's not comprehensive and all inclusive, because we wanted to get this out and giving some examples, but of what, some of them that you may want to consider or implementing in your business or enterprise, right? Everything from risk awareness training. And I think that's sometimes not the sexiest and the most exciting, but something that's the most important, right? And also understanding, these policies and regulations that may apply to your enterprise.
So
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
The other one, as I see, certainly is, I think that, as a developer myself, is that there's one element of the risk that we know of, that, hey, is this code, right? Does it have vulnerabilities? Has it been tested? Are you validating before using it? But there's another element, is I think that we may be easy to forget, right? Is that, what is the licensing, right? Is it open source, right? Is there licensing for this, right? So sometimes, as we know from our favorite Seinfeld episode, you should never assume.
So I'd like to take you through a very quick run of the policy example, just making a policy decision here, or a risk decision really, because a lot of people will say, you know what, I'll make the risk acceptance of using a third-party SaaS LLM. Many will go for open source, maybe will go for on-prem. That's fine. Maybe they will choose to use something specific tool for a specific task instead of going for a platform. Many thinking processes around here. But let's assume that you went through risk awareness training, fine. You abided by the acceptable use policy. I'm going to skip most of the slide, but I'll just say, maybe you can say, I can opt out of future training, for example, specifically for OpenAI. I can remove my history there. Their data retention policies for 30 days, that's good enough for me. But making these decisions requires some sort of understanding. And the idea behind the paper is, number one, provide a beginning to discuss these topics, provide something you can make risk decisions by right now, provide data where you can take and build your own, develop your own policies, talk to the board, and then start talking technologically. We bring an example of some controls that you can start thinking of. But let's move on as we're closing on time.
Yes. So one thing is we want to do certainly be able to take a couple questions here, but as we're wrapping up. But really, I always love a call to action, right? Is, in the business enterprise, first and foremost, right? Identify the risks, right? And the threats that may in your business. Second, and this is the most important one, which I think is also came up as a question in, the Slack channel, is that, is this a CISO risk, right? This is about security getting involved early. Very businesses, services, products, and other working groups may be working and using GenAI, right? Security needs to be involved. That is part of our motion. That's part of our role. That's part of our responsibilities, helping them to identify, evaluate, and certainly how to mitigate those risks. Third, as I always love, especially as developers, it's time to threat model, right? And we drilled into this quite a bit in the paper that we couldn't do today, is that really looking at your various scenarios and what you're using for, and threat modeling is really a blessing. The fourth, right, is that, define this and update the standards and policies based on the risks that you've evaluated or identified and what you have threat modeled. And last but not least, which I think is going to be exciting for the industry, is then what controls, what mitigations, or what guardrails, as Avi likes to use, or Gadi likes to use, is based on those policies and risks, should be implemented and deployed to help you.
And in the 2 minutes we have left, because I understand questions are going to be in the Slack, I wanted to kind of drill down a little bit around technology, because a lot of people who attend SaaS events are very much technologists. So very, very quickly, I believe that as we start looking at technical solutions, we first need to start with what attacks are happening right now. Right now, people are spoofing voices and calling in and trying to do various social engineering attacks. So that's something to look out for in your own organizations. Injection attacks, they're starting to happen more and more. As I said, even when you surf the web around this, it can attack you. When we look at solutions, right now, I think we're not ready for that yet necessarily. But if you started building your own on your own, and there is stuff that I'm building, some organizations out there are building, number one is kind of discover and visibility, enable the business. GenAI actually allows us to do that buzzword, enable the business. Who is using it? What are they using it for? Right? Then you have 3 levels you can immediately start working on. For example, the prompts, and maybe looking at filtering some of that or understanding what's going on. The completions, the responses. A lot of people are looking at bad words. They're also looking at injections. They're looking at personal information, private information coming in through there. There's policy enforcement. You can, for example, create a system prompt saying, ChatGPT, if I send you private information, let me know, or alert somebody, or I can watch for that. There are issues around modern infrastructure. If you choose to use a proxy solution or a gateway solution, how do you go around that? There are levels to consider. Direct use in chat, direct API, internal or on-prem or open source solutions, embedded solutions to Office 365, various modules, plugins, whatever it is. And you can actually look at the future saying there are some unsolved problems scientifically. There are issues around fine-tuning and security, right? It's scientific challenge around real time. If I want to create an insurance something or other for you and I want to update it today, how do I do that? There are risk managers at large organizations, making sure if this model of machine learning comes in, it must have no bias, it must have understandability. How do we do that with GenAI? Not clear. So to finish this off, ask yourself, what actually changes in my assumptions of security? Understand we are all still learning. Again, OpenAI doesn't necessarily understand what's going on. And to answer what was just asked in the Slack, there are stakeholders out there, a lot of processes, definitions of what AI even means. This is a transformation process, and we should engage with the entire business to try and understand how we push this forward. And I would like to really thank Rob, Jennifer, and everybody else for Sons for bringing us in today to talk about it. Get the paper, it answers a lot of questions, but it's a beginning for us. We don't answer everything.
Yeah, in conclusion, the last thing I'd say is that, the community helped build the paper, right, providing the input and feedback on that. And we hope the community will continue to involve to help us continue expanding the space, and building a collective defense, collective, kind of insights and best practices. And that's how we become successful as a community.